POIs verbally, please. With that, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Side proposition describes the relationship of countries refusing to trade each other as basically rich nations refusing to give basic commodities to basically developed and poorer nations as they describe, right? Here are a few reasons why we believe that this is not true. I think what was already addressed in the POI was that many rich nations don't even adhere to the WTO anyway. Because of the virtue and the fact that they are rich nations, they have a lot of bargaining power. And I think already considering the fact that they don't actually have a lot of leverage over them anyway, I think considers the fact that they might not be able or willing to trade these commodities at a cheaper rate completely untrue, right? And I think secondly, I think the major fact that they say that countries do not trade or do not export things or put restrictions on these exports just because they can or just because they want to jack up prices is also fundamentally untrue. I think the reason why most countries do it in the first place is obviously because number one, they have an incentive to basically, reduce and basically protect their own natural resources, protect their own industries, and protect their own prices. But I think number two, I think the fact that essentially they describe it as, oh, these countries do it to jack up prices the same way that the Middle East does it to jack up oil prices. I think there's a reason why it's not necessarily in the virtue of oil, but it's also because of the fact that it's basically necessary like commodities such as food, such as other natural resources which countries need. We'll explain later why these countries actually have a principal right and the principal basically sovereign right to protect these resources and why countries even have the incentive to do it in the first place. I think lastly, the fact they describe it as basically this is such a human rights violation that countries refuse to trade with these countries, that basically Yemen is starving because obviously they can't receive food. I do not think the reason is because these countries refuse to trade or refuse to export. That's clearly untrue. I think the fact that they basically have no capacity to trade with other countries, they're already a very war-torn nation, have no like buying power in any way, I think deems this argument untrue, right? So now let's just go into a few things. I think first of all, what do these trade restrictions even look like in the first place? Obviously, it's like putting a limit on the amount of commodities or basically certain specific things that countries basically are willing to trade, are willing to export. I think our first argument is about how developing nations with a heavy emphasis on primary industries are heavily affected by this. The reason why we would center this around developing nations is obviously because of the fact that richer nations overall in virtue do not listen to the WTO the same way that the WTO doesn't have any leverage over them. I think the reason why it's so crucial in a lot of cases is obviously because number one, they want to preserve the value of their own commodities and basically grow their own industries which basically are developing in their own countries. I think secondly is also to ensure that the supply is adequate for their countries and basically they're not basically flooded in their market full of rich goods and like goods from developed nations that come into their countries and basically raise their prices. I think secondly, we want to talk about protecting the sovereignty of a nation. That's our first principled argument. I think even though they talk about like the greater good of the international community, right? We think that this is fundamentally untrue. I think nations overall and nations fundamentally do have a right to their own principle or policy of protectionism, and they should not be entitled and they should not be pressured by other people, especially when it comes to trade. I think the reason why this even applies so much more to developing nations is because obviously they're developing nations and they basically owe a lot to the international community and face a lot of pressure from the WTO. So I think in this relationship, it's not the virtue of you are not trading. I think it's the virtue of you are being bullied by richer nations who have more power and more leveraging bargaining power over you in order to basically bully you into this. But I think secondly, the basic fundamental right that nations have to basically self-determine or basically be able to decide the policies that they deem fit to their own countries, we think is crucially necessary in a lot of these cases. Before I continue, I'll take a POI.
If countries do not comply to them, there will be doubled down sanctions by the World Trade Organizations. Why would they not comply with it?
I think this goes into the same virtue of why these sanctions oftentimes don't work. I think these sanctions do work when you look at smaller countries such as North Korea. Obviously, they've been crippled by it. But I think in a lot of cases, right, you see the United Nations and you see a lot of other countries, especially surrounding nations that have a lot of bargaining power, there is no use and there's often no power over them to sanction them because they hold such a great leverage over the global economy. That's the same reason why you can't sanction China or you can't sanction the United States. States. Moving on, why do we think that they often have this incentive to do that in the first place, and why does it often apply to developing nations? I think when it comes to developing nations, oftentimes the reason why they even put these trade restrictions in the first place, which have not been explained by proposition, is because obviously they want to keep these resources for their own local people, right? I think the same reason why we give like countries this right and this fundamental protection to basically not like trade their goods or not be able to basically sell it to other countries is there for a reason. I think oftentimes we give it to the right and we give it under the discretion of the economies and the leaders of these people to be able to decide what is best for their nations. I think sometimes in the fact where countries don't even have enough for their own markets, oftentimes when countries have shortages of a lot of like different commodities and a lot of different food products, which we clearly saw during the pandemic, I think is a clear virtue and a clear right to why countries even put these restrictions in the first place, right? So we think that just necessarily forcing them or necessarily like banning them from putting any sort of cap or any sort of limit on how much they export is not necessarily going to help the international community. I think instead it just harms the countries that are involved, especially in the future virtue, because they are oftentimes pressured by the international community and they can easily be sanctioned just as so because they have no power over the global economy. I think secondly, the reason why a lot of countries even do this in the first place is because of protecting local industries and allowing it to even develop in the first place. I think how like global economies work in the first place is like a lot of times like these countries oftentimes do have to sell to richer nations, obviously because in the virtue of their trade, right? Their main industries and their main economies are mainly primary, meaning they have no other services, they have nothing to offer in terms of global trade and in terms of providing for their own economy, right? So I think oftentimes when you do basically force them to remove this cap, right, I think what it allows countries to do is that it basically allows countries to purchase these like cheaper or basically less order goods compared to if you were to basically buy from another nation, right? I think that the fact that the United States often times buys from China instead of buying from Australia in terms of like natural resources in terms of like natural resources and basically obviously these natural minerals, I think is a clear virtue signal to basically how you think that these like trade like relationships and dynamics even work in the first place, right? So why would we even basically value protecting these local industries? I think the reason why they do it is because obviously it allows them to have their own resources, meaning that their own domestic markets are basically flooded with their own resources and they don't have to have any obligation to go and trade it to richer nations. I think secondly, this obviously allows them to develop their own economies and their own industries. I think the fact that a lot of times they're not able to do this because either number one, they have to trade it in order to support their economy, or number two, because of the fact that they don't have any sort of capacity to develop these secondary sectors that basically like refine or process these natural resources is oftentimes like a reason why they do this in the first place. So we think that overall, in terms of like protecting these industries, in terms of like protecting these like nations, we think that you don't affect richer nations because they are not affected by this anyway. I think these global organizations, whether it be the WTO or the United Nations, do not like touch a finger on these anyway. What you do affect are like basically developing nations who have less power, who have more incentives to protect their own industries. So with that, I end my speech here. Thank you.